In the dead of winter, people inside medieval castles fought to survive not an army, but the night itself. No fire was ever strong enough. They didn't go to bed to rest. They went to bed to stay alive, wrapped in furs, pressed against stone, praying the fire wouldn't die before morning. Because no matter how high the walls were or how many guards stood watch, nothing could keep out the cold. It seeped through everything, through cracks in stone, through doors with iron hinges, through floorboards worn smooth by boots and rats. Castles may look imposing from the outside, but inside, they were hollow caverns of bitter air and damp silence. The higher the tower, the sharper the wind. The deeper the hall, the darker the chill. Stone, unlike wood, holds on to cold with a stubbornness that borders on cruelty. By sunset, the walls were already freezing. By midnight, they breathed ice. Fireplaces helped, but the heat never traveled far. In great halls, flames flickered wildly, heating only the backs of the lucky few who sat nearest, while the rest of the room remained lost in shadow. People huddled under layers of wool, linen, and fur, their breath rising in pale clouds with each exhale. The air smelled of damp stone, old ashes, and sweat. Windows, if there were any, were narrow slits without glass, only wooden shutters or animal skins stretched tight. They kept out wind, but not cold. The chill had its own way of finding people, creeping in through floor cracks, curling down staircases, rising from under heavy doors. Drafts could snake their way across entire rooms. Even the noble chambers, draped in tapestries and heavy curtains, were no refuge once the sun was gone. At night, servants made rounds stuffing wool or straw into gaps around doors and windows, trying to trap warmth where they could. Beds were packed with furs, thick cloths, even dried moss, anything to slow the bleeding of body heat. In the richer chambers, feather mattresses offered some comfort, but in the servants' quarters, sleep came on bare planks, or if lucky, straw pallets barely raised from the cold floor. People lay curled in fetal positions, not out of comfort, but instinct, the only way to hold heat in against the raw stone underneath them. Sometimes, entire families or groups of servants shared a bed or a corner of a room. The more bodies, the better. Children were tucked between adults. Dogs were allowed in, not out of affection, but warmth. There was no privacy. Dignity was a secondary concern. Survival. That was the only thing that mattered once the torches burned low and the doors were barred for the night. Those who could afford it wore several layers to bed. Under tunics, woolen hose, thick cloaks, hats, and gloves. Even shoes were sometimes kept on, especially if one had to step out during the night to relieve themselves in a freezing chamber pot or brave the stone corridors to reach a latrine. Cold floors bit through the soles. Bare skin touching stone could sting like fire. If a person's clothes became damp from melted snow or sweat during the day, they risked shivering sickness by nightfall. And sickness was always waiting. Not just from cold, but from what cold did to the body. Slowed the blood, weakened the lungs, numbed fingers and feet. A chill left untreated turned into fever. A cough worsened into something that kept entire chambers awake. The old and very young were most at risk. When someone began to wheeze or burn up with sweat in the night, there was little to be done. No medicine, no doctors, only whispered prayers and damp cloths soaked in herbs. The castle never slept. Even if most lay still, the building groaned. Beams creaked. Winds howled through arrow slits. Rats scurried behind walls. The darkness was thick, and the silence wasn't peaceful. It was watchful. People listened for the sound of fire dying, or worse, spreading. A stray spark could leap from the hearth and catch dry rushes on the floor. In winter, fires were a blessing and a threat. They say fire is life, and in a medieval castle, it was the only thing standing between a shivering body and the slow creep of death. But even fire, for all its light and warmth, was never quite enough. Not in halls where cold flowed like water, or in chambers built not for comfort, but for defense. The truth is, fire didn't heat the castle. It only pushed the cold back a few feet, and not for long. The great hearths, built from blackened stone and brick, were large enough to swallow tree trunks, but they smoked constantly. Chimneys were crude when they existed at all, and most of the time the air in a room filled with gray haze that stung the eyes and clung to clothing. There were days when smoke curled under the rafters and pooled above heads like low clouds. People coughed as they ate. Eyes watered as they tried to read or stitch. Soot settled in corners like black snow. Still, they welcomed the sting, because it meant the fire was burning. In noble rooms, a central hearth roared as long as there was wood to feed it. But even then, the heat rarely reached the walls. The warmth stayed close, shrinking in a circle that left corners untouched and tapestries fluttering from unseen drafts. Lords and ladies sat close to the fire, cloaks draped over knees, hands hovering near the glow. They didn't talk much once the sun went down. The cold made conversation shorter, movement slower, moods heavier. In the lower levels and servant quarters, warmth was a rare luxury. Small braziers, shallow metal pans filled with embers, were placed in the middle of rooms, sometimes carried between chambers like fragile treasures. But they gave off little heat, and the coals often died before midnight. In some spaces, there were no fires at all, only body heat, shared beds, and the hope that the cold wouldn't bite too deep that night. Firewood was never endless. Great stores were kept, but it burned fast. Pine and soft woods cracked with bright flames, but faded quickly. Hard woods lasted longer, but were harder to come by and tougher to split. Men labored from dawn to dusk, chopping and stacking. Servants hauled logs through wet courtyards, and children were sent to gather twigs and kindling from the forest edge. Every piece was counted. Every ember mattered. Waste was unthinkable. In some castles, entire families slept near the kitchen hearth, the warmest place in the structure, even if it meant lying on the stone floor or among sacks of grain. Cook fires, though smoky and constantly tended, gave off a steady heat. The smell of stew, ashes, and sweat mixed in the air. Bread crusts were left near the coals to soften. Even rats scurried in closer during the night, drawn by the same ancient pull toward warmth. But fire brought more than heat. It brought danger. In rooms strewn with straw and filled with cloth, one wayward spark could mean disaster. And disaster didn't need to roar. It could start with a single coal dropped on dry rushes. That's why someone always had to stay awake. Every night, at least one servant sat near the flames, poking the embers, adding wood, watching the shadows. If the fire died completely, it wasn't just the chill that returned. It was silence, deeper than any human was meant to bear. Some tried to cheat the cold by heating bricks or stones in the fire, wrapping them in cloth and placing them under bedding. Others boiled water and poured it into sealed leather skins, resting them near their feet. But the heat faded fast. By midnight, the stones were cool. By dawn, the skins were cold. Nothing lasted long enough, and every new fire had to be built again from scratch. Ashes swept, kindling arranged, breath blown into life, smoke rising up into the rafters like a prayer. Even in their sleep, people listened. They listened for the crackle that meant the fire still lived, for the fall of a log that meant it needed tending, for the hiss of snow melting on the hearthstone. It was a fragile soundscape, made of heat, silence, and the slow, persistent fight of flame against stone. No one trusted the fire completely. It could warm, it could kill, and it could vanish, leaving behind only embers, darkness, and cold that had never truly left. So every evening, as dusk thickened into night, the same ritual began again. When the cold sank deep into bone, and the fire offered no certainty, people turned to something older, simpler, and just as vital: food. Not for taste, not for joy, but for heat. A warm bowl could mean the difference between shivering through the night or slipping quietly into fever. Food was energy. Food was fuel. Food was the only warmth that came from inside the body, and they needed every scrap of it. Evening meals in castles weren't feasts every night. That vision of overflowing tables and roasted meats was rare, reserved for holidays, or for when the larders were full. In truth, What most people ate before bed was humble, heavy, and meant to last. Thick stews of barley or oats simmered slowly over the kitchen hearth with whatever could be thrown in: carrots, onions, dried peas, beans, bits of salted meat, or if nothing else, bones boiled until they softened and clouded the broth. The poor, especially the servants and kitchen workers, relied on pottage, a bubbling mixture of grains and vegetables that changed with the season and the scraps. It was never quite the same from one day to the next, but it always came in the same wooden bowl, eaten with the same spoon, and swallowed slowly, more out of necessity than appetite. The goal was not flavor. The goal was warmth, in the stomach, in the chest, in the hands curled around the bowl. Sometimes, bread was dipped into the stew, coarse loaves baked from rye or barley, blackened at the edges and hard enough to outlast the week. These weren't soft white clouds from a baker's dream. They were dense, dry, often sour, and filled with bits of grain husk and ash from the oven floor. But when dipped in broth or soaked in hot milk, they softened just enough to eat without tearing at the gums. Salted pork or dried fish, if there was any left from summer preservation, was carefully rationed. The pieces were small, tough, and sometimes gray at the edges. But they gave protein, and more importantly, fat, a rare thing in winter, when the body burned through reserves faster than they could be replaced. In some cases, lard or suet was stirred into stew, not for taste, but because fat helped the body endure cold better than anything else. It lined the insides. It stayed with you through the night. For those lucky enough to serve in or near the kitchen, the end of the day brought other small blessings. The scrapings from the pot, the half-burnt loaves, the marrow sucked from cracked bones. These were not waste. These were gifts. The marrow alone, rich and soft like warm butter, could quiet a child's cries or ease an elder's shivers. People learned to chew every bit of meat from the bone, to soak every drop of broth from the bowl, to savor every spoonful as if it might be the last. And yet, even these small comforts were not guaranteed. During sieges or long winters when the roads froze and supply wagons stopped coming, rations tightened until food became a matter of survival in the most desperate sense. Grain was counted, salted meat locked away, kitchens monitored. Servants received watered-down stew, while the Lord's table shrank from abundance to modest plates. The smell of cooking food at night could stir jealousy, even rage. Fights broke out over spoiled pieces of fruit, old wheels of cheese with mold scraped away. Crusts dropped near the hearth. When hunger gnawed hard enough, people became inventive. They made porridge from ground acorns. They boiled old leather shoes. They gathered nettles or dried weeds from the courtyard edges and turned them into bitter greens. Everything was tried. Nothing was wasted. The line between nourishment and desperation blurred quickly when the snow piled high and the firewood ran low. For warmth, they drank what they could. Warm goat's milk if there was any, or more often, a weak ale brewed in the back rooms, cloudy with yeast and barely alcoholic, but thick enough to carry calories. Some mixed hot water with honey, if hives had been harvested before frost. Others sipped herbal infusions, sage, thyme, elderflower. Not because they healed, but because hot liquid did something cold could not. It comforted. When the last spoon scraped the bowl and the hearth crackled into quiet, a different kind of threat began to stir, one that had no face, no sword, no mercy. It lived in the spaces people tried not to think about, in the corners beyond the candlelight, in the cracks of stone where warmth couldn't reach. It came not in loud crashes or shouts, but in the soft scratching of claws, in the twitch of fevered breath, in the whisper of a cough that wouldn't stop. Every castle had them. Rats. Not a few, not sometimes. Always. They were the true tenants of stone walls. They slipped through pantry shelves, chewed through sacks of grain, darted between sleeping forms on the floor. Their bodies brushed against cloth and skin in the night, unnoticed by those too tired to move. They nested beneath floorboards, behind hearths, inside walls. You could hear them sometimes, in the silence, when the fire faded and the world grew still. The soft, rhythmic scraping of claws over stone, the sudden clatter of a clay bowl knocked from a shelf. People feared them, but most had learned to live with them. Some even whispered to them, cursed them, left out scraps to buy silence. But rats were more than a nuisance. They were messengers of something worse, disease. They carried filth, and they fed on filth. Wherever they went, sickness followed. And in a castle where dozens or even hundreds slept close, ate from the same pots, and breathed the same air, one cough could become a death sentence. Illness had many names, but no certainty. Fevers, flux, lung rot. Some called it the breath curse. Others blamed spirits or punishment. There were no doctors, not in the way we think of them. There were herbalists, mostly women, who boiled roots and wrapped bodies in damp cloths soaked with vinegar or sage. They whispered prayers, tied charms of hawthorn or rosemary above doors, burned dried leaves to drive out the bad air. Sometimes it worked. Often it didn't. A single cough in the dark could silence a room. People turned their heads, pulled furs tighter, whispered fears. No one wanted to be near the sick. No one wanted to be the next. But what could they do? The sick had to be kept warm. They needed broth, water, help. Still, some were left alone, left to sweat through their fever and either wake or not. And when they didn't, the castle held its breath. The body was wrapped, carried quietly and buried quickly. Children suffered most. Their small bodies couldn't fight what the cold did to the lungs, what the damp did to bones. A simple chill could become a rattle in the chest, and by the second night, that rattle became silence. Mothers sat awake, pressing blankets tighter, cradling warmth into small limbs, singing songs so softly only the stone walls heard them. Old men wheezed in corners. Women covered their mouths with cloth. The smell of sickness was familiar, a sour mix of sweat, herbs, and something deeper, something final. It hung in the rooms even after the sick were gone. Not even the nobles were safe. Behind thick curtains and guarded doors, illness crept in. Servants carried it unknowingly in bowls, on blankets, in hands not washed because there was no water warm enough. A lord could go to sleep with a chill and wake with trembling hands and lips gone blue. And when they died the same as anyone. Cold, quiet, and surrounded by shadows. Those who stayed healthy didn't speak of it. They hung talismans by the hearth, bones carved with symbols, beads of jet, crosses of wood. They etched signs into the floor, placed salt near doors, slept with iron under pillows. Anything to keep the dark at bay, because at night the castle was not silent. It breathed, with coughing, with footsteps, with the scrape of a rat's tail. The wind moaned down stone corridors. Doors creaked open on their own. Floorboards shifted when no one walked. And every shadow felt thicker than it should have been. People believed spirits walked at night. That sickness wasn't just in the body, but in the air, in the walls, in the very stones. They feared the cold, yes, but they feared what came with it more. When reason failed and sickness crept silently from bed to bed, when fires flickered low and rats danced just beyond sight, people turned to what they had left. Belief. Not organized, not polished, not written in any holy book, but ancient, tangled, and powerful. In the quiet grip of midnight cold, survival wasn't just physical, it was spiritual. And inside the walls of medieval castles, superstition became a kind of armor, invisible but vital, woven from fear, memory, and desperation. Before bed, some whispered Latin prayers they only half understood. Others clutched wooden crosses or kissed worn talismans passed down from parents long buried. But Christianity alone didn't fill the gaps. Not when the darkness felt personal. Alongside the saints were older names, older fears. People lit candles not just for light, but to keep away spirits that moved in silence. They scattered salt at thresholds, hung dried herbs above doorways, tied string around wrists to stop bad dreams from entering the blood. At the foot of the bed, some placed knives under pillows, not for protection against thieves, but against visitations. Iron was believed to drive away restless spirits. Horseshoes were nailed above inner doors. Bells were tied to door latches to catch the movement of something that should not be walking. A sudden clang in the middle of the night could send a room into stillness. Every breath held until someone, brave or foolish, rose to check the corridor. The most feared hours were those before dawn, the time when fires burned lowest, when dreams turned strange, when even dogs stopped barking. People believed this was when spirits walked. Not the grand demons of Scripture, but the smaller, crueler ones. The breath thieves, the soul biters. The ones that sat on your chest and whispered things that made the blood feel cold. Night terrors weren't just bad dreams. They were visitations. And those who woke with bruises or with hair tangled into knots, or who found blood on the sheets with no wound to explain it, they spoke of it only in whispers. Even the architecture held superstition. Spiral staircases were built to the right, so defenders had the advantage. But some believed it also twisted the spirit's path, confused it, made it dizzy. Certain stones in the wall were marked, never touched. Some doors were never opened after sundown. One window was always kept shuttered, not because of wind, but because once, long ago, someone died looking through it. Herbalists didn't just give medicine, they gave protection. Sprigs of yarrow to tuck into the rafters, mugwort to burn when a fever started. St. John's wort tied into charms to keep witches away. These things weren't just plants. They were shields against what couldn't be seen or named. And while priests might scoff, even they sometimes kept bundles of dried sage near the altar, just in case. Children were taught early. Never whistle at night, never call someone by name after dark, never sleep with your feet toward the door. The old rules mattered. They weren't written, but they were followed. Because the cost of breaking them wasn't scolding. It was sickness, or madness, or worse. And yet, these rituals weren't born only from fear. They were a way to feel control in a world where control was scarce. A way to push back against the overwhelming truth that no one, not lord, not priest, not servant, could keep the night entirely out. So people clung to what they could. A prayer spoken the same way each evening. A bundle of dried lavender beside the bed. These small acts made the difference between panic and peace, between silence that crushed and silence that could be endured. Because when the fire cracked for the last time and the last candle flickered thin, what you had left was belief. Not in stories told at Mass, but in the breath of the room, the weight of the blanket, the way your fingers curled around a charm worn smooth from years of touch. The line between real and imagined didn't matter. What mattered was that you did what your grandmother did, what her mother had done, what everyone before you had done when the dark came knocking. Not all suffering was shared equally inside medieval castle walls at night. Where you slept and how said everything about your worth. The nobility occupied the highest chambers, distant from smoke and noise, yet still prisoners of stone-cold silence and restless dreams. Their beds, though lined with wool, furs, and embroidered cloth, could not shield them from the breath of frost slipping through cracks. Curtains hung heavy around them, not only for warmth, but as a symbol, a barrier between power and everything below it. Fireplaces burned in their chambers longer than anywhere else, tended by servants instructed not to wake their lords with noise. And yet the heat reached only so far, pooling at the hearth while corners remained stiff with chill. Nobles woke in silence, blankets clutched tightly, aching from stillness more than rest. Comfort was never absolute. It was comparative, a matter of degrees, not certainty. A feather mattress was still a poor defense against a night that knew no master. Beneath them, life was colder, louder, and crowded in ways those above rarely imagined. Servants slept in clusters, curled beside one another on straw pallets scattered across uneven floors. There were no private quarters for most, just shared rooms near pantries, hallways above kitchens, or alcoves carved between storerooms and cellars. Spaces were taken not with entitlement, but with urgency, claimed by those who reached them first after duties were done. Some slept fully dressed, cloaks pulled over faces, boots left on in case they were summoned at midnight. Others huddled under coarse blankets layered with cloaks, rags, or animal skins collected from the butchery rooms. Sleep was fragmented, often broken by creaks in the floor, unexpected calls from superiors, or the moan of wind whistling through loose stones. People muttered in their sleep, turned often, and breathed heavily. A crowded rhythm of exhaustion without relief. There was no concept of stillness. The rushes underfoot whispered with every movement, and mice rustled in the corners where flour had once been stored. Chamber pots were kept close, emptied by morning if not before, and the stench of waste mingled with stale smoke and damp wool. Candles were rationed, so darkness ruled after fires were doused, leaving faces only half visible in the weak orange glow of dying embers. Some servants shared spaces with animals, not by accident, but by design. Warmth had no loyalty, and a sleeping goat offered more comfort than an empty room. In the stables, grooms lay between hay bales, close enough to hear horses shift but far enough to avoid kicks. Every corner of the castle, no matter how foul or forgotten, became a sleeping space for someone, provided it offered even the slightest barrier against the cold. Sleep was not truly rest. It was suspension. Bodies stopped moving, but the mind listened for everything. For boots on stairs, for a child crying, for the fire collapsing into ash. Those who served directly under the Lord might be woken to stoke coals, carry messages, or assist with a late-night illness. No hour was safe from interruption, and no bed ever truly belonged to the person lying in it. Even within the servant ranks, distinctions existed. The steward had a door to close, the cook a warm corner near her ovens, while the scullions and stable boys shifted wherever space allowed. The youngest were placed between others for insulation, but also for protection, from rats, drafts, or the cruel teasing of older servants half-mad with fatigue. Hierarchy lived in blankets as much as in bloodlines. People didn't complain. Complaining was wasteful. Instead, they made small rituals, folding clothes a certain way before sleep, placing tools beneath bedding to keep them from theft, muttering fragments of prayers known only to themselves. These habits weren't luxury. They were anchors. They reminded the body what came next, even when every day felt like a repeat of suffering in new shapes. Sleep came not as a gift, but as a surrender, one you made only because the body had no choice left. And when morning came, you rose again, slowly, limbs cold, faces blank, minds already turning to duties not yet assigned. Inside the same walls where lords dreamt behind velvet, servants began another day beneath stone, preparing once more to be forgotten. The first to rise were always the same: the kitchen hands, the wood boys, the women with cracked fingers who stirred ashes before speaking. Their feet touched frozen floors without hesitation, not because they no longer felt pain, but because pain was the price of routine. They moved without speaking, without pause, without need for direction. In a world ruled by repetition, motion became memory's substitute. The body remembered what the mind had forgotten. Fires were rekindled with last night's embers, coaxed back into strength using bark, kindling, and breath that fogged the cold air like smoke. No one complained. Words wasted energy. Only work could beat back the frost that still clung to walls, to blankets, to the insides of ceramic cups left too close to outer doors. There was no reward for surviving the night. Only the return of tasks, the continuation of roles, the endless rhythm of necessity. In the halls, those who had slept near warmth stretched aching limbs slowly, as if even movement might wake the cold again. Others, curled beneath cloaks beside fireless hearths, unwrapped themselves like forgotten packages and blinked at the gray light as if seeing it for the first time. No one spoke of the night. It was already buried, in sweat, in silence, in the stiffness of fingers too numb to close. Where death had come during the hours before dawn, it was acknowledged without mourning. A body was carried carefully, wrapped in wool or linen, taken to storage or earth depending on what the ground would allow. No songs were sung, no speeches offered. Respect was not in words, but in how gently the dead were handled, in how quickly space was made for the living. The night always took something. The morning simply recorded what was left. Outside, the snow, if it had fallen, was already marked by footprints and ash. The courtyard spoke of preparation. Firewood stacked, stables checked, frozen water buckets cracked with iron tools. Chickens pecked in corners where grain had been scattered, and dogs sniffed the wind for signs of something stirring beyond the walls. The castle, at last, exhaled. Still, people moved. Still, they rose. Still, they stepped into the cold again, not out of courage, but out of something older. That slow-burning will to continue, even when there's nothing left to gain. A mother handed her child a crust of bread. A steward counted barrels in the cellar. A mason inspected a crack in the outer wall. No one looked for applause. They only looked for daylight. Because light meant time, time meant work, and work meant survival. The luxury of hope did not live here, only the resolve to last. And for the people behind these thick, beautiful, brutal walls, that was enough. If you enjoyed this story, trust me, the next ones will be even more powerful. You're about to hear things no one else is telling. Subscribe to our channel so you don't miss what's coming. If this video moved you, leave a like and drop a comment. And most importantly, share it with someone you care about. See you in the next video.